and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. It's an 8-week online course where I teach with an internal pelvic floor physiotherapist, Kelsey Valentine, about how to get your CrossFitters, weightlifters, powerlifters, athletes in general back to sport after having a baby. And so I hope you guys are having a wonderful week so far. Up in Canada on Monday, it was Thanksgiving. Ours is much earlier than you guys in the US. And so because it was such a short week, I feel like I have been running with like a chicken with my head cut off since the beginning of the week. So I can't actually believe that it's Friday already. So TGIF, I guess. And so today for the podcast, this is a topic that I have been thinking about a lot, especially the more and more immersed I am in the pelvic health field. So I'm not an internal pelvic floor physiotherapist, but we've been running classes called Strong Like Mom, which is a pre-postnatal exercise program for about 2.5 years now. I've seen women through their pregnancy and in the postpartum, especially when there wasn't a internal pelvic floor therapist around. And then when Kelsey decided that this was an area that she wanted to go into, we've collaborated a lot with many women. Good morning, Kelsey. And so especially in the world of lifting, there has been a lot of fear that has been given to women in terms of knowledge and information that I do feel is trying to come from the right place about how you should never lift heavy because of risk of prolapse. You should never, Valsalva, hold your breath while lifting. You should never use a weightlifting belt. And those nevers, like you absolutely cannot, always do not sit well with me. Not because I think that it's coming from a bad place, but I think that there's never this line that is drawn in the sand when it comes to any sort of movement because everybody's body is different. And I also think that in general, as a society, and you've probably heard me say this with the Jerry PT podcast, or segment rather, that we don't have a movement problem. We have a lack of movement problem in our society. And by instilling fear in movement, sometimes I think we can be doing much more harm than good, even though we are coming from the right place. So this is what's got me thinking about the pelvic organ prolapse issue. And so for people who aren't quite sure what POP is, it's a descent of one or more of the pelvic organs into the vaginal opening. And it's graded by the amount of descent that you're seeing. So it can go from grade 1 to grade 4, where there's a mild amount of descent versus the organ is protruding outside of the vaginal opening. And this is often made worse by activity, by bearing down. Coughing or sneezing can cause a further descent, increase in intra-abdominal pressure. And women who are experiencing pelvic organ prolapse describe things like as they're sitting up, it feels like they're going over a marble because that descent is affecting that smoothness as they're going from a recumbent position to sitting. They'll describe a heaviness. For very significant prolapse, they'll describe having to splint by almost inserting a digit into the vaginal opening to allow them to void their bladder. Things like that that may be present with pelvic organ prolapse. And so the thing with pelvic organ prolapse that I've seen, and I'm gonna start making these parallels to the bulging disc, is that there was a study that was published in 2002 that showed that 83% of women at 6-week checkup had a pelvic organ prolapse after a vaginal delivery, and 52% of those were at least grade 2. So we're at least trying to descend down to the level of the vaginal opening, especially with things like bearing down. And so when I think about those statistics, and I think 83% after vaginal delivery, and how many of those people are symptomatic? Because this is what happened with the bulging disc. We have a pattern of pain that happens with discogenic low back pain. So we have had people go and do MRIs, have a diagnosis of a bulging disc, and then feel like their back is forever fragile, that they are always going to be at risk for a chronic disability, that they have a disability because they have this protruding disc and it's never going to go away and it's something that they're going to have to live with for the rest of their life. And we create almost a deconditioning effect because people are now afraid to move because of their bulging disc. And so what was the response to this? Amazing campaigns like Get PT First looked at some of the research that showed that people, as they got older, even if they had never had back pain in their entire life, we kind of know this narrative, right? That they have a bulging disc on MRI, and that does not necessarily mean that they are in pain. And so the amount of referral for MRIs to look at a bulging disc, especially if it's not a neurological emergency, has gone down significantly. And in Canada, you have to give a justification for an MRI for low back pain because we knew that it was a poor use of healthcare resources and that it didn't change the course of care, whether it was protruding or herniated or bulging or whatever terminology you want to use, and it actually may not be the true source of the pain. So does that mean that in orthopedics that we have completely gotten rid of treatment for discogenic low back pain? No. If somebody is experiencing discogenic low back pain and they are in that pattern, then what do? We calm the tissues down and we build them back up, right? So we want to try and, use whatever modalities in our toolbox to try and reduce their pain, especially in the acute setting. Then we're going to try and reduce their fear because we know how much fear is surrounding low back pain, and say, your body is very resilient, it will heal, movement is not bad, you are not going to make this worse. And sometimes that is the best thing that you can do for low back pain, right? And then we are gradually going to encourage movement. I always say to my clients that if you can get to see me within the first 24 to 48 hours of a very acute episode of low back pain, I will be able to help you much faster because the only thing that I'm going to tell you is move as much as you can within your tolerance. And yes, it might be slightly uncomfortable and you may feel some pain, but you are not making it worse, and movement is going to make it better. So we have that narrative. We've gone through that story in low back pain, and I feel like we're better for it at the other side because we've kind of gone through this transition in how we as rehabilitation professionals deal with low back pain. So why am I seeing parallels to this with pelvic organ prolapse? With the rise of social media, there has been some amazing things that have been happening with women's health. Before, any symptom that you had was just, you just had a baby. And sometimes they would assume that if you were leaking with coughing or sneezing, you're like, yeah, that's just a mom thing. And the tides have changed where now there's a lot of information about what we can do if we have something like a diagnosis of pelvic organ prolapse. However, now we are having people who 20 years after their diagnosis of prolapse still feel like they can't do certain activities because it's going to exacerbate their symptoms. They have described it as a chronic condition, as a disability, as something they have to live with, as something that has negatively impacted their self-esteem, has negatively impacted their quality of life, when 80% of women at 6-week checkup are experiencing some amount of pelvic organ prolapse, myself included. I had a grade 1 pelvic organ prolapse before I had my daughter. It obviously persisted, probably got slightly worse after my vaginal delivery. I am not symptomatic. I don't even know if it's still there. Who knows? It could be, probably, but I don't have any pain. Just like if you were to MRI my back, I have a bulging disc. It is just life. It has just been what has happened. When you are pregnant, your organs literally shift. You are placing the weight of your uterus, which grows for 9 months, down across that pelvic organ support, and then you push a baby through your birth canal, which is going to cause some movement and likely some descent of your pelvic organs with that type of maneuver, that trauma that happens to your body. But it is the best trauma in the entire world because I have my daughter. But now what we're starting to see is that women are coming knowing that they have a pelvic organ prolapse and thinking that they are in this horrible state, that they are always going to have these issues. And what's happening is that fear catastrophization that happened with bulging discs is now happening with pelvic organ prolapse. And I think that that's unfortunate because we know that with the way that the symptoms manifest themselves, that you can have a person with a grade 4 pelvic organ prolapse, a more severe issue, and they can be completely asymptomatic. So they're being told that they have a prolapse, never had any symptoms, Google it, figure out what the symptoms are starting to develop those symptoms, and then go to a pelvic PT. We've had some clinicians in the in my online cohort who were talking about getting referrals from midwives for prolapse. They had no symptoms at all. And now they were worried that there was something wrong with them or that their pelvic organs were about to fall out of their body. And so now we have this thing where we need to start talking about the fear. And so we know that the amount of pelvic organ prolapse that you have is not necessarily going to be a direct correlation to the amount of symptoms, if any, that you experience, very similar to a bulging disc. We are now seeing that fear is high once you have had that diagnosis. And so people are catastrophizing their pain. We are seeing a biopsychosocial impact to pelvic organ prolapse. Feel like people are starting to have negative impacts on their mental health, quality of life, all of these things that have also been shown in things like a bulging disc. And so we as internal or non-internal therapists need to be helping to try and ease that fear, saying you are not broken. This is a very normal part of vaginal delivery. It may be common. That doesn't mean that we can't treat it. And just like people who are presenting with discogenic low back pain, we can treat the symptoms. So that's not to say that if people are experiencing symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse that I am dismissing them. That is 100% not the case. Just like if I was seeing somebody with discogenic low back pain, I would not dismiss them. But my course of care would not be contingent on the degree or grade of pelvic organ prolapse. I would be addressing their symptoms unless I thought a referral for a surgery like a bladder mesh or something, or like a neurological emergency for a bulging disc was necessary. Then the degree of impairment would reflect my referral to the appropriate healthcare provider. And so for an individual who comes in with pelvic organ prolapse, I'm going to try and diminish their fear, acknowledge that this is something that they are going to have for the rest of their life, but they are not going to be symptomatic for the rest of their life. This is not going to stop you from being able to do the things that you want to do, which could be running, it could be weightlifting, it could be CrossFit. It is fine that we will figure out ways, we will gradually load it. Just like any other orthopedic injury, we're going to gradually increase the volume, intensity, range of motion, impact, all of these variables that are within our control as physical therapists who also have a good understanding of strength and conditioning. We are going to manipulate these variables to minimize symptoms and gradually load it. So just like with a bulging disc, we're going to encourage people to move. We're not going to say that you need to, stay still and not do. People were told that they could never walk up a hill because they have pelvic organ prolapse. I was like, well, that's a really weird way to walk around your life, because if you're going down a hill and up a hill, you're gonna have both. You can't just go one way and always go one direction down a hill. That doesn't make any sense. But they were fearful now that if there was a hill on their walk that they actually were not able to do it, or they're gonna have to take a different route, which to me is just crazy. So if you are working with this population, I hope that you found this podcast helpful. So know that although we can have a diagnosis of pelvic organ prolapse, that does not necessarily mean that we are going to be chronically disabled. That does not mean that we are going to be completely symptomatic forever. It's going to be that it's something that we're going to be aware of, that we know what the signs and symptoms are, that we know if we potentially pushed a little bit too far. And that's just the same as if we had a bulging disc. That bulging disc is always going to show up on MRI. That does not mean that we are always going to have low back pain. It means that we're going to gradually load the tissues that we're able to tolerate more and more and more. That sometimes we may have a flare up, but that means that we know that we pushed it a little bit too far. Let's take it back a little bit, let the tissues calm down, and then continue that progression. The same thing is true in the POP world. So I hope you guys kind of thought the same way. I'm really interested to know what you guys think, because I know that there's some internal pelvic floor physiotherapists that probably wouldn't agree with me. So if you have a difference of opinion, put them in the comment. Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? Have you seen this population? Is this something that is really interesting to you? If you want to continue this conversation in more educational settings, this is a big topic of discussion in our 8-week online course for the clinical management of the fitness athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. Our next cohort is starting in January. So I hope you guys, if this is something that's really interesting to you, that you consider jumping on to our next cohort. All right, have a great weekend. I hope you guys are gonna have a wonderful, wonderful Friday, and we will see you all in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.